Thank you, everyone, for watching this follow-up podcast to our event that was held on Thursday, September 12th, Hot Topics for the Upcoming Proxy Season. I'm Ellen Richstone, and I'm the Programming Chair for the NACD New England chapter. Since our program was limited to 60 minutes, and we had so much great material to discuss, we just didn't have time to get through all the questions that were posted in the chat. So we decided to do that now, as well as leave you with some key takeaways when it comes to preparation for the 2025 proxy season. I'm going to turn it over to our event moderator, Gloria Larson. Gloria is a lawyer, public policy expert, respected Boston business leader, and outstanding public company board director. Gloria, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ellen, and we're all delighted to join this great audience for a second time. Thank you for being here with us. I'm going to reintroduce our panelists from the September 12th event. Matt DiGiuseppe serves as the Managing Director at PwC's Governance Insight Center. PwC, as you all know, recently released their much-awaited proxy season recap, and it will serve, as it did last week, as sort of the underpinnings, data-wise, of what we're going to be talking about today. We're also joined by Brian Kegery, who's a partner at Morgan Lewis's Boston office. He counsels both public and private companies on a wide range of corporate law, mergers and acquisitions, and other business matters, including, of course, all things proxy season. So let me just jump right into some of our great questions, because this is a terrific opportunity to get to the things that we couldn't get to last week. And I'm going to start with governance simply because governance proposals, while they were down a little bit this year, certainly the response was not. Response rose among shareholders broadly for those proposals that dealt with pretty much traditional shareholder issues, things like elimination of supermajority vote, declassification boards, declassifying classified boards, and things like that that received majority votes. And many of the issues received more than 30%, which is kind of the point where shareholders and directors both agree that it's time to pay close attention. So thinking about what happened in 24 and seeing it as a bit of a predictor for the future, Matt, I think I will start with you to just give us a bit of prediction around what we might see going into the 25 season. And then I'd love to get your thoughts too, Brian.
Yeah, and prediction is always a difficult task, especially this year where many of the proponents that file these proposals are still formulating their plans. And so it's easy to get out in front of them. On the governance proposal side, it is a topic that's addressed by some well-known shareholders, and they have at times sort of taken on additional issues beyond sort of the core governance practices you described. This past year was a much more focused campaign on governance-related topics. And generally, the proponents are looking to file proposals that they think will pass and addressing sort of governance matters where they think companies should be pressured to adopt what's become an emerging best practice on things like simple majority for bylaw requirements or changes, as well as majority voting in director elections, like you said. And obviously always keeping the toe in the door around board leadership and the separate CEO chairman proposals, which don't pass nearly as frequently as some of the other governance proposals, but I think you allude to, they do receive that high level of support where it draws significant attention and can start a conversation. And I expect them to sort of go down that path again this coming year, especially with a large number of proposals in those categories having passed, indicating that there is sort of a market desire to see companies move in that direction, even if that request or pressure is only coming in the context of a shareholder proposal. It doesn't mean that the preference doesn't exist amongst shareholders more broadly.
What would you add to that, Brian? Those are really good stuff.
Yeah, that's excellent. The only things I guess I would add would be, and we mentioned this last week, declassification of boards, and just again echoing Matt, some of the more baseline governance type things that, well, the ESG and DEI and other big ticket items were at the forefront. I feel like as they've slowly fallen back and they're less exciting than they used to be. Traditional governance proposals, I wouldn't be surprised if they come up. Others, I'm curious what happens with the request for additional political disclosures, lobbying, things like that. If after the election, people will still be thinking about it and it'll be at the front of everyone's mind, or if the election will have happened and our activist friends decide to look elsewhere for the next 3.5 years.
Well, they didn't fare very well this year. I think they were pretty much rock bottom support. So does that lead you to think that they may go, if not the way of the dodo bird, but sort of be out of fashion post-election? I think that's a really good point. I've been wondering the same thing. What do you think about that, Matt? You guys get to see and really parse the details around things like that. These sort of, out of sequence, really, unless you look at the tenor of the times.
Yeah, the out of cycle political proposals, if I think over the course of the past decade or so, they do sort of pull back somewhat when they're not in sort of an active election year. At the same time, we haven't seen the fall in overall support that we saw this year in the out of season sort of support in previous years. So those two things combined may actually cause a pullback. I think political contributions is one of those topic areas where it could fall governance, it could fall social, it could fall environmental. It's sort of difficult to classify, and why it's different than some of the other governance proposals that we're talking about is it's the only one where it's not as easily a yes/no question, right? If your board is elected annually or not is a yes/no question. Whether or not you have a separation, there's grayness in sort of the leadership, but it's relatively yes/no. Political contributions is one of those areas where we can come back to what was the theme for our previous discussion, which is disclosure matters, right? So it's not just yes/no in terms of support, but it's yes/no in the context of the disclosures that companies are making, which have generally approved, which may be part of the reason why you're not seeing sort of that overall support level that you might have otherwise seen.
So, Brian, I want to go back to a couple of things that you both brought up relative to the governance category, if we can just stick with that for a couple more minutes. When you think about activist investors broadly, what are you seeing with the call for independent chairs of boards outside the Fortune 500, where that's become considered more and more a best practice by many, although still a large minority segment? But what about the mid-cap and small-cap companies?
I see it much less now. I'm curious what Matt's data says, but anecdotally, I see it as less of a concern usually because of those smaller companies. The CEO and chairman, or sometimes the founder of the company, they're still around, and it's sort of a more of a cult of personality that leads the company. It's the person that calls the shots, and typically, recently they may hold super voting shares, and it's a controlled company. It's less, I feel like, the younger, more up and coming companies that raise that concern. In addition, there's the use, when you do have the combined chair CEO role, you have your lead independent director in almost all instances these days. And I've seen that sort of placate any letters or any questions that people get from their investors asking the company to explain how they're comfortable there. Is they say that we have our CEO chair role, but we also have our lead independent director who effectively does the role of an independent chairman. It's simply, it's a different title for almost the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Matt, would you add anything to that?
No, I think sorry, I say no, but then I'm going to add something, which is that one of the things it's easy to lose in the theme here is that when you talk about board leadership, the concern for investors, if I go back and put on my old investor hat, is that there is an independent voice in leadership in the boardroom, not necessarily what the title is. I can see some companies, right, where there's a chair, an executive chairman, a CEO, and a lead independent director. You've got all three. right? Because the executive chairman's doing a transition or something of that nature. It might be that founder that's transitioning out of the day-to-day. And that can work as well. What's really important is that you explain to shareholders why your leadership ensures that there is a space for an independent voice in the boardroom and making space for that dialogue and challenge, despite what titles any individual might have.
Yeah,
So
Matt,
oh, sorry, go on.
oh, sorry, I was just gonna say that, Matt, I think that's spot on. It's investors don't care what you call who's in charge. They just want to know that there's somebody that's independent on the board that is not affiliated with management, that is, sort of above the management level and is keeping a close eye on what's being done. And if it's the lead independent director or an independent chairman, as long as you, in your disclosures and in your investor outreach, can effectively communicate that, I feel people are less concerned with following the more European model of they're absolutely separate positions.
Yeah, that flexibility. It's interesting. I've seen the movie multiple times where you have either the CEO holding the chair or the fully independent chair, but then the CEO moves into that executive slot and someone becomes, for a period of time, really the point you were making, somebody becomes for a period of time the very effective lead director. So I'm not sure, again, that's the kind of thing with well explained, everybody's going to go, yeah, it was a great CEO. And as long as there's a fully independent lead director for what looks like in many cases, there's a planned period of transitioning then out of the board. So the other thing I wanted to ask you about was this idea of who remains and how are you advising them? I might start with you, Brian. How are you advising your clients who are kind of what I would call the holdout clients when it comes to moving to annual election of all directors on boards? I mean, I kind of scratch my head about that.
Yeah, some clients really do like it, and they view it as effective, sort of shark repellent. They think it helps protect them. They're not worried that 1 year they could just get be in a proxy fight and then all of a sudden they're looking at a completely different board. So the clients that feel strongly about it, I find if they're able to adequately explain their reasoning behind it and they can make clear that this is not entrenchment for entrenchment's sake. This is not, we don't value our shareholders and their opinions. It's rather, we're typically a relatively green company. We're relatively small. There's some very large, very well-heeled activists out there, and having this as a black and white rule in our charter is something that provides us this additional protection where if, and I don't want to use names, if a large investor were to come knocking at our door, a large activist, their war chest is magnitudes larger than ours is, so we wouldn't be able to effectively fight this. Having this helps protect us a little bit, and investor helps protect you because you likely also, you invested in us. So we want to be able to continue doing what you believe in, not spending money fighting an activist. That's typically what I see explained, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It depends on who you're talking to and how they feel about it.
No, that's helpful. Let me move on, if it's okay with you two, to a little bit of a few of the questions around environmental and social issues, sort of broadly. We didn't get too many, which kind of reflects the record that they had this past year in terms of being supported by shareholders. But I think most of us know about the House Financial Services Committee on Oversight and Investigations, and they did a hearing that sort of goes along the theme of, when you try to divide the E&S proposals into pro and con, which has now become such a gray area, but sort of thinking, are companies really rising to the occasion and defining what they're talking about when they talk about ESG and particularly climate and environmental related data that they'd like, that everyone would like to see better explained through disclosures, even with the rules that we now have, as well as maybe the influence of proxy advisors in sort of supporting, getting the big asset managers and large investors and the smaller, and clearly the smaller investors to think in a certain way. And I'm sort of wondering about the landscape and sort of how you see what seem to be more and more kind of blurred lines around how, because so many companies are now moving to just talking about sustainability more broadly and less focused on these categories. So Matt, you sort of own this reservoir of data that sort of, and I think you probably spend a fair amount of time kind of parsing what's really happening with what used to be sort of the ESG agenda, but now people have moved to try to define it in each company's own way. How can we be 10 years down the road?
So I remember probably, I want to say it was about a decade ago, where when I was talking about sort of the idea of engagement proxy voting from the investor lens, I started to emphasize that the objective was to discuss material environmental and social and corporate governance matters with companies as a reflection that not everything under that umbrella of ESG is necessarily going to be the most important issue for any given company, given its growth cycle and where it might want to be, right? And I feel like I was maybe a little ahead of the curve, because as we got into sort of 22, when support for these proposals peaked, it felt like, you could just talk about ESG as a terminology and it was all positive, right? And I don't think that it's wrong that folks in the market started to question whether each and every topic that could potentially fall under that umbrella was the most important topic for any company to be focusing on at any given time, right? Which is sort of where you heard people going with the discussion. Today, I think there's been a parsing of language to some degree, where you start hearing people talk about sustainability instead of using the terminology ESG. And I don't see that necessarily as simply a change in terminology. I see that as a fundamental sort of recognition and desire to return that focus back to the issues that don't necessarily show up in the balance sheet, that are core and fundamental to the business being sustainable for the long term. And as board members, I know that's not something that anyone has changed their necessarily approach away from or to, other than maybe having additional reporting and additional data that led to better parse out sort of what are those most important issues versus those that aren't. And I think that's the trend that's happening in the marketplace that is actually a net positive, right? Because it's not about addressing everything and addressing everything equally. It's about thinking about the funnel at your organization, where you have things that are going to be very important on the ground, right? But as you move up in, level from folks on the ground to management, to the C-suite and to the board, the topics that are going to need that discussion and that focus and that connection to sort of thinking through the strategy and how to be successful becomes necessarily more narrow, and actually allows for better discussions. So I think that's what you see happening. It's a difficult environment to have disagreements, generally in the world today. But I think that if you sort of refocus the discussion back to that idea of, what are the issues that affect the sustainability of the business, you'll find that those issues have always been managed, if not directly, then indirectly behind the scenes. And there's a space now and a vocabulary and a lexicon to talk to the market about the value you're creating that's come out of the pendulum sort of swinging back to some degree. So hopefully it's a net positive.
Well, that's a really interesting take and a way of doing a look back and sort of gauging how far we've come, maybe in a level of sophistication in what matters to each company and how they describe, to your point, what's actually material through a lens of, we want to be the company that is sustained over time because we reflect the communities we operate in, and we reflect our customers and third-party vendors, and clearly our own talent in-house and climate, both defensively and offensively. So, it's like that combination of things, but every company is going to be different. But if you can explain that, I think it also moves away from, and maybe this was what I saw too much of, was almost cause advertising, sort of wearing things like a Eagle Scout set of badges on your sleeve, whether you'd actually done the work or not. And it was hard for people to tell. What would you add, Brian, to this sort of thought? Because you're the one who has this list of clients sorting out, what do we call the report this year?
Gosh, I adding anything to what you and Matt just said will be difficult. I don't want to gild the lily. That was excellent. All I can really add is that it is now being, at least from what I'm seeing, people are now realizing that ESG is not, you're either for it or you're against it. It's not necessarily a thing that is driven by your views on the environment or whatever. It's, as you guys just said, these are things that we as a company believe are important so that we can continue operating years down the line. Not this is something we're doing for charity or something we're doing out of the kindness of our hearts. Now, charity and kindness are also very important, but companies being able to think about and disclose the reasoning behind why these things are important, I find it very important. My hat as a SEC disclosure lawyer continues to come on, and I'm sorry for that, but it's about the disclosure. It's about effectively telling your shareholders, we are committing or we're targeting this metric in the future because we think it's important for the future of our business. Same as we're hoping our adjusted EBITDA 5 years from now is this. We're hoping our emissions are this. Similar, because we hope that we continue to operate our business in such a way that it can be successful down the line.
So speaking of metrics, just maybe a few words about how you see this mishmash of reporting, because we've got in the US, of course, SEC, California climate, SEC broad set of disclosure requirements, and then the Euro corporate sustainability reporting directive kinds of things for companies that have a base in EU companies. So Matt, what are you advising clients? I mean, what kind of metrics, and will we ever, I know you told me not to ask this, so I'll let you take a pass, but when will we get to some sort of global set of standards that everybody can understand and actually believe it?
I mean, interoperability is the dream, right? Being able to think about all of these on a global basis is where people want to go. I think there's still some shaking out that's going to have to happen in the various different disclosure regimes before we necessarily get there. But I'll say one of the benefits, I think, of that is that companies are thinking about their sustainability and ESG data, not in terms of delivering against one report, but being able to create that data lake so that you can deliver against the different reporting requirements that are out there, which is good, because it means you're creating data that's not just for the purpose of reporting, but that you can use in your business to do a better job running your business, right? Which I think, if you talk again, if I put on my old investor hat, that was the goal, right? It's not just give me data, right? Here's something that I think you can actually use to run your business better. So there's one benefit to that. But we are going to see the first round of CSRD reports coming out in the near future, and for many U.S. companies, it's going to be in 26 on 25 data if you have operations in that region. The U.S. companies that don't have operations in that region aren't going to necessarily be required to put out the reports themselves, but they probably need to be collecting this data because there's a good chance that they do business with a company that's operating in that region, right? So just not operating there doesn't mean that you might not have some work to do to maintain strong relationships with your clients, and you want to think about that. And then, companies are making the choice about whether or not they disclose on an artificial consolidated basis at the local country level or at the parent level. Again, CSRD as a board member, these are terms that you're going to want to learn and sort of engage around, right? At least sort of understanding the way management's making those decisions. But that word salad I just provided is evidence that it's probably not going to be simply comparable data across the globe and from company to company in this first round, as sort of that global baseline shakes out, right? So it really is worth a deep conversation about what do you have to disclose? Why are you doing it the way that you're doing it? Does that make sense for us? And what do we understand about the partners that we operate with and what we need to do to be a strong partner to them? Because you do see this stuff showing up, but not just in sort of what you disclose to shareholders, but in RFPs and in those sort of business to business decision makings, where we come back to that whole idea of, how do you have a successful business? Part of that is being able to provide the data that your partners need in order for you to operate.
Well, when you think about how we rely on data for everything else in business decision making, I mean, this getting to that point that you've described makes a lot of sense. Before we move on, Brian, would you add anything to that discussion?
We have GAAP and IFRS, and we've been doing accounting for how many?
Yeah.
So I would not bet on there ever being a universal disclosure regime, but I hope as years go by and people are able to understand what's important for their business and what's important for their investors, that it'll be an iterative process, and everything is an iterative process. We're just hopefully we're taking steps forward and not backwards.
I think if we can just get to the point where you can understand the story it tells appropriately, and then maybe make those comparisons across peer group or something. It's just, it doesn't have to be the perfect worldwide standard, because that is unlikely to happen, and maybe it's not a good idea anyway.
I will add to that, Gloria, because by the time this program hits people's inboxes, we will have our report out where we did a survey of asset stewardship professionals. And the piece of disclosure that they were most interested or thought there was the biggest opportunity for improvement was how management connects their sustainability story to the business strategy. And so I think, as you hit on right there, that story is really where it's growing.
Well, agreed. Boy, I'm glad to hear that data point, and I will be looking for that. It's very useful in all contexts. So I want to merge two sets of questions. One about sort of the role of proxy advisors in everything we're talking about, and their support. Basically, there are many companies that just follow right along what ISS and Glass Lewis have to say. And has it reached or has it always been? Is it more outsized in terms of influence, less so? And then I'll move into a couple of quick questions about activism and maybe a little bit about AI too. But let's start. What are your views around proxy advisors who, as long as I've been around in the board world, they've existed, and we're glad to get the high praise, and also look for the support. But companies also will hold to, in so many cases, to what they believe is right, and say, well, we'll take a bit of a hit this year and not worry about it too much. But I don't know what your perspective is on the level of sort of power and influence that they have.
Brian, you want to take this one? I've been starting on quite a few questions.
I'm
sure your clients share their opinions with you.
Let Brian go for it.
I'll share the opinions I can share in an open setting.
Yes.
So proxy advisors have certainly gained a lot of power over the past several years, and I'm seeing my clients, my companies that are working with them, they find they can be frustrating or they can be an ally depending on what the company wants to do and how it shakes out. I'm seeing more and more companies, not even more and more now. These days, it's pretty much everyone. You have to ask yourself how ISS and Glass Lewis are likely going to respond to any proposals you put out there that are anything outside of just the bog standard re-election, say on pay, and auditors. It's something that is just now a part of doing business. It's right up there with, is this something that we can do? Because you're not only thinking about your investors that you're speaking with and you're hearing from them, you're thinking about, you almost treat them as your largest investors in every instance, because you think if there are these funds, there are these groups that will follow and pretty much vote however they're told. So you have to think, what can I do? How do I get this a positive recommendation? Some clients bristle at the interplay with the vote recommendations and the speaking with them beforehand, and they will tell you how they will likely vote depending on how you change your proposal. And I've just read generally that there's some complaints out there about the potential conflict of interest. I haven't heard much about anything being done with that, and I'm not sure if it needs to be done, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least bring that up as something that I'm hearing in the wind.
That's Yeah, and it's been around for a while, that idea of, well, the idea of shouldn't they have more oversight from somebody, somehow, some way. So it's a really good point. Would you add anything to that, Matt, before we move into, I want to ask at least a question about activists as we move into another potentially busy season.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The only thing I'll add on the proxy advisors is it's worth spending some time sometimes in parsing out when the proxy advisor's recommendations or policies are a reflection of your largest shareholders' expectations versus when some of their influence, like you mentioned, Brian, is coming from them sort of, honestly competing with each other and trying to be a little bit ahead of the market and sort of understanding where they fall in sort of their influence, because it does vary depending on the topic area and the issue and some of those elements, right? There are some elements where the market is aligned behind their guidelines, and there are some where they're just not. And you have to take that 25 or 10 or 15 or whatever number you want to put on it sort of impact on the vote, but recognize that that's not necessarily where the bulk of your shareholders are, and treat it appropriately in that context, right? Versus giving them an outsized influence just because they can get the vote results up to a number where someone might look at it versus nowhere close to it actually passing.
Yeah, I mean, a good reminder to do your outreach, to speak with your investors and to hear from them, because they may say, yeah, we'll follow what they tell us, or they'll say, we think they're a little conservative on this. An excellent example was officer exculpation charter amendments that went through that Glass Lewis and ISS were split on how they handled those, and several clients had still wanted to do them and spoke with their investors, and by large part, investors were fine with them. And they said, please go ahead, we don't have any issue. And it's not being afraid to reach out to your investors, and most of them like to do it, and they like to hear what you're thinking, and they like to be heard, because I'm sure they'll tell you if there's something on their minds. They say, listen, officer exculpation isn't a thing, but you have a classified board now and you've been public for 20 years. Let me know why you still think that's important. So it's just having that discussion out there. You're not screaming into the void. You don't have to be as afraid of ISS and Glass Lewis, as Matt said, if you have that market data on your own cap table.
Well, thank you both. That was really terrific, useful information. I do want to ask one question about activism, and that is coming from our cue from last week's program, and that's about, are activists becoming more realistic, probably because of the universal proxy, but in sort of better aligning the actual shareholdings that they have to their requests in terms of board seats. So is this actually becoming something that then individual, the large scale investor group can applaud too? Sort of these things are moving in line better with one another. Do you think that's happening? And Matt?
I don't know that it would be a perfect alignment, right? If you think about the average board size being about 10 to 12 and very few activists taking a 10% position, even when they're sort of establishing themselves. It's not necessarily about the alignment between sort of their shareholdings and what their ask is, but what I do hear anecdotally from the board members we talk to, as well as from activists, is that they are putting forth better candidates for consideration as, what would be sort of independent additions to the boardroom, and really doing their research there. Where I've heard from a number of board members that welcomed on someone that was nominated or identified by an activist, never went through the proxy fight, and they see some value in sort of, them almost doing some recruiting on their behalf. And so I think that makes it a little more, I don't want to say easy or palatable, but just a little less antagonistic when you think about sort of welcoming on an additional independent board member versus a portfolio manager or, MD or someone from the actual activist shop. And that has definitely been a change, I think, in the approach that activists have taken, especially, post universal proxy.
So let me ask you both one really quick question, if it's possible. All of these are very meating, but when I think about AI and you look at the details, minority number, but still significant, over 20%, were showing their interest of investors in what are companies doing. We talked a little bit about this last week around the structural protections around AI. And I'm just wondering if what this says to you when we look at 25 in terms of what companies should be doing. And I'm going to start with you, Brian, for a quick answer. Are you advising your clients, both disclosure and shareholder engagement wise, to think about AI as now an emerging important topic?
Oh, absolutely. And it's something that just has to be addressed, and it's something that is on the front of a lot of people's minds, rightfully or wrongfully so. Your company may barely be using it, and that might be correct for your company's size or industry or whatever. It's the hot button topic right now, and it's something that you need to be ready to talk about, either to explain and disclose why you've taken these steps, or why what your plan is for AI. It's something that every company, from a small biotech even to Fortune 500, you need to be able to speak intelligently about your plans for AI. I'm suggesting we put in disclosures, if possible, putting in
Yep.
what directors are conversant in artificial intelligence, or discussions on that. You're seeing that being added to everyone's favorite matrix. Like, so and so is an expert here, here, and here. I'm seeing that get added. It's not an SC disclosure requirement, but it's something that you see done. So I'm definitely suggesting.
So now I'm just going to ask you guys for really this lightning round, your sort of final thoughts for all of the directors who are hearing this program for season 2025. What are the takeaways that you think are most important, just in a really short, maybe just 2 or 3 quick things that don't forget on your to-do list as directors?
I would say engage with your stockholder base. Don't forget to do that. That's extremely important every year and is important next year. Artificial intelligence, which you just talked on, have a plan. Think about what you can put in your proxy. Think about with your nom and gov committee if you need to add somebody. CISOs, I was hearing, are increasingly being added to boards for that reason. And the third one, I guess, would just be to continue to keep an eye on your compensation disclosures. That was, Say on Pay had a great year last year, but it can turn on a dime if markets turn on a dime. Who knows what happens over the next few months? So continue to keep a close eye on those and keep them up to snuff. Don't get lazy.
3 terrific takeaways. Okay, Matt.
And I'm going to just build on that with one that will wrap it all together, which is continue to think about, refine, and hone the story that you're telling the market about not just the way the company operates, but also the way that the governance at your organization contributes to effective oversight. The proxy and related disclosures are no longer just a compliance tool. And so I think it's important for board members to spend some time sitting with that story and making sure that the best possible one is being told.
Well, from the voices of 2 of our best experts ever, that's a wrap. I'm going to hand this back to Ellen.
So Gloria, Matt, Brian, thank you so much from NACD New England. This is our first ever that we've done a follow-up podcast. So if folks are interested in more of these, please let us know. We, of course, are very lucky to have had 3 such experts, Gloria, Matt, and Brian, to do this for us. We thank you again for your time and hope to see you soon at a future NACD event. So have a wonderful day. Thank you.